We're really thrilled to have such great speakers today. We have Professor Colin McFarlane, who's joining us from Durham University in the north of England, and he'll talk to us about his work on urban inequality, urban experience, and density. We have Caroline Hood, who's joining us from Robert Gordon University, and she's going to be talking about her work on transport inequality, particularly in relation to cycling. And finally, we have Dr. Ian Mell, who's joining us from the University of Manchester, and he'll talk about green space inequality. So I shall let Colin, Caroline, and Ian present, and over to them, over to Colin.
Okay, thank you, Alice, and thanks for organising this evening's event. Well, it's evening here, it might not be where you are. Thank you to everyone who's joined to say hello. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about density and COVID-19. And this is going to be a series of kind of reflections and really questions about density and COVID-19 and what perhaps the crisis provokes in terms of how we think about density in the future as a normative question, as much as a changing set of imaginaries and processes. So I'm going to share my screen, which I guess means I will disappear. Alice, you can tell me if my slides definitely are going to be visible to people. Is that clear?
I can see that. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. So I think before the crisis began, we were in a situation where density was one of those kind of key concepts in urban research, but also urban policy and urban practice. And there was a lot of heated debate about density, about what it was, about how it's changing, about whether it's good for the city and in what ways it's good for the city and so on. But there was also a very a powerful sort of pro-density position in relation to this question in cities, in urban planning, and also in mainstream kind of urban thinking. A sort of idea that density is kind of a solution to all kinds of problems in the city. That density might be good for example, for climate change, for building more low carbon compact urbanisms, which are less predicated on sprawl and car-based mobility. That it was good also for the environment, for the economy, that it helped foster innovation and agglomeration, that it also was good for social life. And there's all kinds of histories around these claims about density, but you have this sort of set of arguments put forward by urban economists, by architects, by policymakers, planners, and a whole variety of groups across the global north-south divide about density as a kind of urban good, and many of us are familiar with that. So you have this kind of pro-density position, and then along comes this strange little virus, and of course everything gets turned sort of upside down. And there's kind of a, in the immediate kind of context of the pandemic, there's a kind of anti-density sort of position in the form of this kind of immediate density reduction. So a kind of immediate sort of fear of or apprehension, density almost as a kind of pathological thing, in which density is seen as something that we have to immediately withdraw from. So of course we see the emptying out of city centres through lockdowns across the world, and various voices initially in the process of this happening, very prominent voices like Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, sort of actively talking about density in the city, and kind of this kind of imagination of what the concentration and compression of people into urban space might do to the virus, to infection, to hospitalization, to death, and so on. So this kind of captured, I think, a lot of the media debate and a lot of the social media debate around density at the time, at the beginning of the crisis, really around sort of March, April. So we've seen this kind of weird sense in which density is suddenly in question, in flux, in a really kind of powerful sort of metaphysical kind of way. Right, let me see if I can try to change the slide. Yep. And so then, as the crisis goes on, of course, density and its relationship to COVID shifts around quite a bit. There's a growing awareness that it's not density per se, which is leading to, for example, infection rates or hospitalization or death, but actually much more certain types of practices and spaces. And one of those kind of developments across the months that followed sort of March and the lockdowns was a recognition that certain types of indoor spaces where people are sort of cramped or compressed or crowded, and these are very sort of pejorative terms with long histories, was producing kind of longer or higher sort of rates of infection and hospitalization. So, for example, crowded homes, we saw emerging research showing that so-called crowded homes, particularly in poor neighborhoods in places like Birmingham or London, but also in the US, including in places like New York, were more likely to lead to higher rates of infection, hospitalization, and death. But also certain types of working environments, migrant camps in Singapore, garment factories in Leicester, which of course led to one of the first lockdowns, local lockdowns in the UK, and sites of hospitality. So, for instance, in the US, the debate around sort of air-conditioned restaurants in the southern states and the extent to which they did or did not spread the virus. So suddenly there's a more kind of textured notion of density, and it shifts from a kind of notion of density as a problem out there in the city in general to a kind of more sort of nuanced concern about density in here, in certain kinds of interior spaces over time as people are compressed into certain conditions. So we see this sense then of densities kind of imaginary shifting through the crisis. At the same time, there are practices shifting on the ground, in addition to these kind of imaginaries of density, which raise questions about whether density as a geography, the geographies of density, the spatial distribution of people across cities and urban regions, may be in some kind of flux. And we've seen these debates over the last few months, and they've kind of increasingly deepened and intensified. So, for example, we might put COVID-19 in the middle there and see a set of networked interrelationships that bear on the question of density and its urban geographies. So, for example, housing. Well, we know, for example, about the question of overcrowded housing and poverty, which I was just talking about. And that was one of the debates around density and COVID. But there's also been other debates around housing. So we might think about how in the UK next year, the prediction that the housing market will shrink by 14%. The kind of the tracking of sort of a growing kind of emphasis on suburban or more rural or smaller town housing markets potentially growing in some places, whilst they shrink in perhaps city centres where they have been very overheated for a long time. And again, this is a very mixed geography. And evidence, of course, as well about, for example, private rented high-rise housing being some of the worst places to be during the lockdown and what the legacies of that might be. So there's a bunch of debates in that kind of housing bubble, if you like, which are kind of related to this question of changing urban geographies and density, but also in other spheres. So retail, for example, we know, of course, the shift to online shopping, the consequences for the high streets and shopping centres, the possibility of certain smaller towns growing faster than city centres in relation to retail. In terms of office space, it looks like for a lot of middle-class white collar people, there will be a kind of permanent shift to working from home in many contexts. So lots of empty office space in towns and cities. In terms of public space, there is a greater emphasis on sort of walking and cycling, a sort of deepening connection between the notion of public space and well-being. Debates about the 15-minute city in places like Paris and elsewhere, which have intensified, this idea that everything could be within a sort of 15-minute walking distance, or should be. Again, very class-based kind of arguments. And of course, debates around travel. So we know, for example, a very slow recovery of public transport. Think of the London Underground, for example, whilst we see a concomitant kind of worrying trend of dependence on sort of private car use and so on. So a whole set of consequences coming together in a kind of networked way, which may lead to a series of shifts in the distribution of densities in the city and across urban regions as a result of the crisis. So I keep shifting. Oh, I keep shifting, my slides keep disappearing for some reason. Let me get them back. So a set of changes that are going on, and it's possible that these changes may indeed solidify and kind of harden in the urban landscape over the coming years, because many of them accelerate trends which were already in motion pre-crisis. So cities were increasingly de-densifying and expanding. Retail was already shifting a lot of it online. More people were starting to work from home. All of this was already in train before the crisis. And in a sense, what's happened is that in a space of 6 months, potentially 5, 6, 7 years of change has been kind of intensified. Potentially, it's a question. Lots of major American cities have seen over the last 20 years growth in their kind of more suburban or peripheral areas rather than densification in their sort of downtown areas. Again, perhaps the housing market changes may enter into that, as well as the labour practices and retail practices around COVID. And so you might be seeing then a set of changing geographies of density and expansion that we see in Indian cities across the world, that people like Solly Angel and colleagues in New York have been tracking for some time, this kind of expanding direction of travel for cities over the last couple of decades. So it's possible then that these new geographies of density and densification and re-densification across urban and regional space are going to be with us, but partly because they crystallize and catalyze a set of trends already in motion. So the overall kind of point I want to make here is that this is a radically kind of uncertain context, and we don't quite know where this is going. I think that's true, but we do know for sure that density as an idea and as a process is kind of in flux. There's a sense in which it is at stake, and people are questioning it and reflecting upon it and its role in the city in a way that perhaps we haven't done for a long time, and at a scale that we haven't done for a long time. So the question, I think, for urbanists who are interested in questions like social justice is how might we repopulate this idea of density to make it work better for people across the city, across the world. And here I just want to end really by flagging up three kind of interrelated domains, which I think are important for how we revalue the notion of density, because I think value is a very important idea in relation to density, because up until the crisis, perhaps too often, it was kind of thought about largely as a kind of economic value that was linked to certain forms of social living in the city, which were typically middle class forms of urban development. And we were seeing this accompanying the kind of booming overheated real estate markets in cities across the globe. So how might we think about value differently in a more social way? And there's three kind of areas I want to just flag up briefly. One is around governance. So there has been a renewal, I think, over the past 6 months or perhaps an intensification of debates around how we govern the city and what impacts that has on the densities we see around us. And in particular, I think lots of voices arguing for a much stronger rights-based agenda. So recognizing that the crisis has indeed hit some of the poorest in our cities much more, often but not always in dense configurations, often but not always Black, Asian, ethnic minorities. How might we commit ourselves to a new rights-based agenda that focuses on homes, that focuses on an economy that works for people rather than simply for profit, and for local democracy? So we see, for example, debates around new municipalism, looking to cities like Barcelona, but also the longer history of rights to the city, and kind of an intensification in some places of calls for that kind of social agenda. We also see, I think, a kind of an opportunity to catalyze those interventions across the urban world, which have sought to regulate and prevent more exclusive forms of high density living. So, for example, in Berlin, before the crisis, the 5-year rent control freeze goes some way, albeit partially, to try to control the kind of proliferation of sort of higher end densities, exclusive forms of dense neighborhood and housing. And also a set of kind of initiatives around promoting public goods which serve densities better. The recognition that across the world, often the poorest and densest communities are the ones who struggled most because they lack public amenities and public space that they can rely upon. So, for instance, looking to domains like sanitation, where in San Fernando in the Philippines, a new tax before the crisis introduced resources for sanitation to poorer neighbourhoods, or in other spheres of infrastructure such as transport, where you see cities like Tallinn introducing free public transport, or Sao Paulo extending the bus lanes. So I think there's a kind of opportunity, and indeed a sort of moment of catalysing a sort of rethinking of governance in order to organise and operationalise densities in a more socially inclusive way. And the second kind of interrelated example that I want to get at is around sort of urban form. And here I'm thinking, literally of the built form, and in particular of calls to think more holistically about the built form, to think about ways of connecting lower income neighbourhoods in particular to different infrastructures around the city, and to think specifically about the home and the neighbourhoods in that context. So people like Jo Richardson's work, which I think is very important on housing, and the work she's done since in relation to COVID, arguing that we need to think about the home in relation to green space, public space, to think much more about architectures at the level of the neighbourhood for social purposes, rather than what we often see, the kind of co-option of architecture into kind of higher end densities, or the kind of images we often see of higher end, more kind of elite oriented densities before the crisis. And there's all sorts of examples of architects doing this work. So for example, in Mumbai, a city which I know a little bit, a group like URBS, architects and urbanists who are committed to working with dense low-income neighbourhoods in ways that improve their infrastructures and services, and try to provide improvised, incremental, socially relevant infrastructures and housing to dense forms of social and economic life. And I think there's lessons we can learn from those kinds of activists. And thirdly and finally, in relation to the question of knowledge, and I think this is really fundamental to the question of density, whose knowledge configures our imagination of density and dense urban life. And we know, that some of the urban economists who I mentioned right at the start have kind of set the tone of a lot of this agenda in ways which has sometimes been rather kind of controversial and perhaps even exclusive. So urbanists like Jay Pitter in Canada arguing that we need to think much more carefully about sort of forgotten densities, the densities of neighbourhoods, often Black, often working class neighbourhoods, which haven't featured centrally in the planning of densities and in the imagination of what densities might look like. And there's all sorts of examples, again, from activism, which foreground the knowledge and imaginaries of dense, kind of often neglected neighbourhoods. So groups that I know of, Slum Dwellers International, operating across the world in dense slum neighbourhoods, producing sort of maps, census data, but also accounts of how density might be differently organised to operationalise social and economic life for the people who live there. The Asian Coalition for Housing, there's many examples across the US working in working class Black neighbourhoods, for example. Some techniques that have been around for a long time, like participatory budgeting, help to connect forms of knowledge within dense poor communities, not always only dense poor communities, of course, but connect those knowledges to an economic agenda of redistribution in the city to kind of channel resources towards those neighbourhoods around housing and infrastructure that I was talking about. So these kind of three areas, governance, knowledge, and form, I think are deeply interrelated, and they form a kind of a larger set of questions which I think we want to, well, those of us who are interested in more socially inclusive cities and densities want to try to repopulate in the moment of crisis that has opened up in front of us. So in summary, I think density is in flux in a way that it hasn't been. I think that without kind of using that old crass kind of term about opportunity and crisis, every crisis produces opportunities, there is nonetheless a moment now to repopulate this idea at a global kind of, in a global debate. And also I think too that there is a time, an opportunity here to connect that to the economic, to the urban and the economic much more closely, which I didn't get into much in this presentation, and to try to reshape densities that work better for those who live in cities. So I think I've got a couple of minutes over, so I'm going to stop talking there. Thanks, Alice.
Thanks, Colin. That was brilliant. And I can see we've got questions coming in already. So I think we'll pick up those questions when everyone's had a chance to present, and that way the whole panel can contribute to those questions. So I think, Caroline, are you ready to share your screen and present on your topic. I think you're muted. Oh, sorry. There you go. Sorry, that was my fault.
With great power comes great responsibility.
That is true. I failed.
I also need to be able to share my screen as well.
Have I not? Sorry. Right. There you go. Okay.
Sorry, I am just... Hopefully this works. There was a bit of an issue with some privacy settings there where my computer was not particularly happy about letting you all see. I'm hopeful that now you can see my screen.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. As Alice said, my name is Caroline Head, and I'm a lecturer in sociology in the School of Applied Social Studies at Robert Gordon University. That's my email address on the slide there, if you want to get in touch. And you can also follow me on Twitter for what I will warn you now is generally bicycle and cat themed content. Here's a brief overview of what I want to cover. First, I'd like for us to think about what COVID-19 has exposed in terms of both our transportation system and for how and when we travel. Next, we'll turn our attention to some of the potential inequalities in travel that COVID has also reminded us of, before moving on to think about relationships of power and how we can foster a just approach to transportation. As you will perhaps gather from the title of my talk tonight and from this lovely photograph of my bike in happier non-COVID times, an important research and personal interest of mine is cycling, and it will form the central theme of this talk. That's not to say we won't consider relationships with other modes, but my starting point is from the perspective of a bicycle user. Another caveat is that my research focuses in on Scotland. So I'll be making use of some Scottish specific data and referring to cultural norms that exist here, but I hope our international attendees can still extract the broader relevance of what it is that I'm saying. So first, I'd like us to turn our attention to what COVID has exposed about how we travel. And what you can see on the screen here is the sustainable travel pyramid. And this is something that many nations, including Scotland, aspire towards in terms of prioritising sustainable travel behaviours. And in reality, the pyramid usually is the other way around, in the sense that the private car is at the top. However, both the travel bans imposed during the initial lockdown period in the UK on the 23rd of March and the concerns around potential transmission of the virus on our public transport systems meant that our political and indeed medical advice forced many of us to reconsider how we travelled. Bike sales in the UK during lockdown rocketed, and I know from my own area, many more people were out walking and cycling than really I've ever seen before. I think we can probably all enjoy the irony that it was a global pandemic that forced the prioritisation of walking, cycling and wheeling. The Scottish Government also made available funding through the Spaces for People programme to local authorities in Scotland to enable the implementation of measures aimed at fostering walking, wheeling and cycling. And this ranged from pop-up cycle lanes to road space being given over for pedestrians and for wheeling as pavements were temporarily widened. And needless to say, it won't come as a shock to you that not all of these measures were met with public acclaim. And a scan through the social media, through local media, will demonstrate this. But I think what COVID has shown us is that perhaps albeit for a brief period of time, the power dynamic in our towns and cities actually changed. And the car was no longer king. And we were really beginning to see this inverted pyramid. So much of how we think about transportation is dominated by what I've characterized on this slide as my need versus your need. And as you can see from the statistics on the slide, 71% of households in Scotland own at least one car. And I think that's an important stat when we think about these relationships of power that I've alluded to, and we think about what COVID meant for the way that we travel. But it's also important to note that 29% of households in Scotland don't actually own a car. So how are they travelling? Are they reliant on public transportation? Are they walking? Are they wheeling? Are they cycling? And how do we manage and prioritise these competing needs? If we think about a typical rush hour traffic jam back in the pre-COVID days, is it right that single occupancy vehicles are creating congestion that determines whether a bus full of people arrive at their destination on time? We also need to consider what I've termed shared space conflicts. And this is where there's potential for those who are walking, those who are wheeling to come into conflict with cyclists. And we see this most often in shared use paths. And really, we need to have a considerate approach to that. But where we also see shared space conflicts, and it's something that COVID highlighted once again, was when more people were out cycling, there was still a potential for that shared space conflict with other road users. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a subsequent slide. And alluding to some of what was discussed in the previous presentation, in our construction of spaces in towns and cities and in our management of travel hierarchies, we also need to ensure that we're not acting with the best intentions, but actually creating situations that are inherently ableist. And I think we need to ensure that we retain a person-centered approach so that the construction of shared spaces don't inherently disadvantage those who are visually impaired or those who have specific mobility needs aren't inadvertently excluded from society and from these shared spaces. And there are emerging conflicts as a result of the temporary spaces for people measures, and it's a subject of ongoing investigation in Scotland. And we need to make sure that this dynamic of my need versus your need doesn't actually create additional power imbalances. And that's something that's been emphasised in the spaces for people exercise in Scotland. And it's something that I know people are keeping an eye on. So now that we've established a little bit of context, I want to go into a little bit more detail about these power imbalances, thinking specifically about bicycle users and about a group of individuals I'm going to describe as car drivers. When we consider the status of cycling in Scotland and in the UK, I'd like to think that no one would disagree with me when I say that it has a marginalised status, that those who choose to cycle are in the minority, and as a result, find themselves navigating a cityscape that was designed for 4 wheels, wasn't really designed for 2. When I think about my own hometown of Aberdeen, the economic prosperity brought by offshore oil and gas has created a situation whereby cars are very much examples of what we call conspicuous consumption. And what I mean by that is that for some, their chosen vehicle is an overt statement about their wealth, about their status in society, and really about the overall power that they wield as a result of this. Furthermore, we can also suggest that their self-identity is linked to their car. And so that a cyclist should dare to occupy road space in the vicinity of such an individual is not always going to end well. And the power dynamic is such is that there's a belief sometimes that the cyclist does not belong in that space, that there's not a place for someone on two wheels next to someone in four. And if we turn our attention to what can only be described as a corrosive obsession with journey times, we actually enhance this belief that the car is the dominant partner in this relationship between bicycle user and between car driver. And who is the rightful occupant of that space? And if we're focusing on journey times, you could say that the car driver is the one who has the most entitlement to be there. And there's a really strong emphasis at the moment, and it persists in transportation policy, about getting from A to B quickly. So journey times, how many minutes does it take me to get from one side of a city to another, for example? And it favors the convenience, the flexibility, and the speed of a car. It just does. So it's not actually just a question of infrastructure or of culture. We could have world-leading infrastructure, but without an appropriate shift in cultural aspiration, in belief and expectation around travel, these power imbalances between bicycle user and car driver can't be readily resolved. And this is why the change in that we saw during lockdown, in terms of these increased levels of cycling, in terms of these pop-up bike lanes that were taking road space, bicycle users were given permission to occupy a space that culturally hadn't always been previously acceptable to do so. And that's fascinating. So looking further into this idea of power imbalances and why they matter, it leads us to consider now the power of the other. And I have a quote from Michael Koval-Anderson on the slide, and it says that separating out cyclists as a category separate from other travelers allows for otherness and the creation of hierarchies of value among road users. And what I mean by this concept of othering is treating someone as being completely different from you. It facilitates marginalization and the creation of inequalities across many aspects of society. But in this context, I'm interested in thinking about how it creates what Koval-Anderson describes as these hierarchies of values and the consequences that you can have. Now, hopefully by now you've had a little bit of time to absorb some of the key features on the picture on this slide. And I think it's a neat, if not slightly unsettling, demonstration of the power of othering and how it can lead to dangerous consequences. And by seeing cyclists as somehow less than, as not having an entitlement to occupy spaces in our towns and cities, and by extension across our road networks, it can actually lead us into a trap of seeing somebody as an inconvenience, as an obstruction. And in this process of othering, we actually fail to identify them as human. And that's really what this "what do you see" picture is about. That you shouldn't just see an obstruction, a lycra-clad inconvenience. It's somebody who has a life and who has a place in society. And that's really the danger there of othering. So why does this process of othering occur? Well, it's because we construct the other and they appear different to us. And we can see how the stereotype of a typical cyclist can help to facilitate this. And when I first started talking, when I first said the word cyclist, what's the image that popped up in your head? Was it lycra clad? Was it male? Was it somebody on a sporty road bike with ultra thin tires? In challenging these stereotypes and constructing campaigns around cycling that feature people that would be, quote, just like me, I think is a really important part of actually tackling this stereotype, and that it can broaden the appeal and the social acceptability of choosing a bicycle as a legitimate mode of transportation, which it so often isn't viewed as. And this is because social norms dictate what we see as acceptable behaviour. And I remember really vividly once cycling to work one day, and somebody leaned out their, I can't remember if it was a car or a van, And they shouted at me, why can't you just be normal? And I thought, yeah, okay. And this is why COVID represents an unusual and unforeseen opportunity for changing the way that we do things as a society. We're seeing society change and evolve before our eyes at the moment. And the increase in cycling during lockdown shows that there's appetite for more opportunities to cycle, but we need to capitalise on a very limited window that we have to change, particularly as the way we work and the way we function as a broader society is changing. So reflecting on all of this and thinking about what COVID has taught us about when and why we travel, how can we create a just approach to transport? Why should you care? Well, equality of access to transport means equality of opportunity across education, across employment, and even access to healthcare. It demonstrates that we aspire to be a fairer and equitable society. One approach we can take is to think about that sustainable travel pyramid and adopting a person-centered approach in our decision-making. It sounds a bit utopian, but it is an approach adopted by Edinburgh City Council recently, and it offers us the opportunity to break away from traditional hierarchies and to break away from our societal love affair of the car and to legitimise bicycles as an appropriate mode of transportation that's normal and socially acceptable. So here's some conclusions. I finally got to the end. I think I may be running a little bit over time as well, so sorry, Alice. COVID has changed the way that we see our cities and our towns and how we move around them. And I think I agree that this is an opportunity for change. And I believe that policymakers need to consider the power imbalances that shape our shared spaces and think about how we can best go about addressing those power imbalances for all the reasons that I went through in this talk. That we need to adopt a person-centered approach to the way that we think about how people access services and about how people use our shared spaces. Finally, I'll leave you with a quote from the wonderful Peter Cox from his book about sociology of cycling. And he refers to bicycles and the act of cycling with this wonderful term of velomobility. And he says that socially inclusive mobile futures may require velomobility, but velomobility on its own may not bring about a more socially inclusive future. So while I might think that bicycles can save the world, they might not, but they're definitely part of the solution. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was brilliant. And I think certainly coming from Caroline's talk and Colin's talk, it's clear that obviously COVID hasn't caused these things, but it's rendered things visible that we may have chosen not to see in the past. And yeah, an opportunity for us to discuss some of these things. Okay, so Ian, can I hand over to you?
Okay, thank you, Alice. And I'd like to thank Colin and Caroline for setting the bar so high. But also, it's always quite nice to go last because you can then basically take all the ideas and incorporate them into your own work. So a lot of the things that Colin talked about and kind of really resonate with what I'm going to discuss today. So about parks and their role in COVID and their role pre and potentially post-COVID. And this is going to be slightly more personal and reflective because at the start of COVID, a lot of people saying, oh, this is what you do parks, are you going to do work on it? And it took me until about last week or the week before to start thinking about it practically from a work perspective, because I couldn't get my head around the position we were in with lockdown, with the fact that we weren't allowed to go to work, the kids couldn't go to school, and it became very, very depressing. And we got to this. And this is just some of the selfies that I had over the last 6 months. Bizarrely, the one in the bottom right is the most recent one. That was the one from last week when I was shattered in Welcome Week. But I look at these and go, oh yeah, there were some bad months and there were some better months. And what this means to me is that as somebody who researches green and open and public space and parks, as somebody who made the decision to stop going to the park at the top of our street because there were too many people who weren't actually behaving themselves and following the rules, as somebody who understands the mental and physical benefits of being outside and somebody who understands the value of those places to society more generally, I actually stopped going for about 6 weeks and I didn't really go outside because I was so distressed about other people not following the social distancing rules. So even though I know it's good for you, I made the decision to make it worse for me. And so this is just sort of starting to turn around now with, being allowed to go back into work and those sort of things. But what was really hitting home with this is that there are these power imbalances in terms of how we plan our cities, what resources we are making available to different communities, how that has changed historically over time, from, if we look at Victorian parks and their remit to be for everybody and be all inclusive, to maybe slightly more Thatcherite and neoliberal ideas of you owning that nice green space but other people can't use it. And to start to think about issues of access, issues of quality, and issues of functionality. And the notion that Caroline brought up of shared space conflict is really, really important here, because we would all hopefully assume that parks are for everybody. They're a resource that everybody can make use of in many different ways. And in many ways, that's one of their primary benefits and values, is that they can do so many different things socially, economically, culturally, and environmentally, that actually it doesn't just have to be one thing for one person. They're not homogenous. And I think because of that, there's an acceptance that parks can be different things. And I think within particularly the middle part of the lockdown, we saw a lot greater people engaging with the environment, actually going outside, spending time in parks, because they were being legitimized to go to the park in the middle of the afternoon. They didn't just have to go on a Saturday morning for park run. They could go for other things as well. And I think that was really important. But as we've sort of come out of that lockdown, and in Manchester we're going back into that lockdown today, so it's been an interesting couple of days, we start to see these questions of who are parks for, who are they built for, who are they managed for, who pays for them, and therefore who considers themselves to have an ownership over those space, to becoming more and more prominent again. And a lot of this work is contextualized by 10 years of austerity in the UK, funding for local government and for parks and green space management being cut to the bone. Cities Newcastle, Liverpool, Manchester, London have seen extensive cuts to their budgets, and so the quality of those places has been questioned, because do you provide social services and healthcare facilities, or do you provide parks? And for many communities, they've seen to go away from parks. But when we look at what parks are, they mean so many different things, and that their form is so different as well. You could have the £9 billion Olympic Park, great space, there's lots of different things. You could have an urban park in Brasilia, so the top middle. You could have the green space of the Thamesmead estate, and the way in which he's tried to incorporate green into all forms of their urban landscapes, that you actually provide parks and recreational facilities for people on low incomes in social housing. You could think about Belfast and the way in which parks are used there to separate and to integrate between different communities, and how that's been exacerbated by COVID, that more people have been going outside, so actually some of those invisible social barriers might have been broken down a little bit. And then you get areas such as the picture in the bottom right, which is from Hong Kong, of very small urban parks where people are using them because of a density issue. So, and again, density might not be the issue, it might be the number of people and the activities they're doing. So we have to think quite carefully about distribution, urban form and demographics. And a lot of people would say parks are open to all, but in reality, in places like New York or in London or even in Manchester, there are parks that are open, but actually they might not appear so. And Hong Kong is a great example of this, where all new housing is supposed to have publicly accessible parkland attached to it. Sounds super. But they then put a fence around it and a guard hut, and you have to walk past the guard to enter it, and the guard will question why you're there, which isn't exactly friendly and nice to let you in. So again, we have to think quite carefully about the ways in which how things look and how we perceive them, and our rights to those resources can shape our behaviour about it. And there's lots of different approaches to this. So historically in the UK, we actually had a quite philanthropic view about green and open spaces and parks. We built them for everybody. I'm not sure why that's there, sorry about that. The Wirral in Birkenhead Park, the first publicly accessible park, was developed to provide that space for people who didn't have it. And I think we might be moving away from this slightly, away from this philanthropic understanding of public resources being for everybody, because we're now starting to think about private spaces, or the way in which we can make spaces more special, but only for a certain group of people. And I think the Garden Bridge development in London was a prime example of this, presented as a fully accessible public open space park across the Thames, but actually it would be closed off for a significant proportion of the year for private events. You couldn't hold balloons on the bridge if it got forward, you couldn't play a musical instrument, and you couldn't skateboard. There are a lot of sort of very strict rules about that place. So in terms of its accessibility and its usability and its function, that could be questioned in terms of what it's supposed to be doing for a number of different people. And I think one thing that we have seen over the last few months is a growing discussion of this discussion between the resource itself and its access and its functionality. And people like Laurie Nesbitt at the University of British Columbia, Meredith Whitton at the LSE in London, Leslie Mabon at the Scottish Association of Maritime Science have all been looking at some of these ideas about it's not just about the location, but it's actually about how people are using those places in different ways. And I think that leads us to this question of access and what does it actually mean and who is access for? And I think a lot of the work that's come out quite recently has started to question whether we can actually think about access as being this homogenous thing. And it's a point that Caroline made about ableism, that we're assuming that everybody has the same needs and the same abilities to engage with these places. But actually, if you have a physical disability, if you're blind, if you're deaf, you might want to engage with parks or green space or public places in very different ways. But actually that's not always very clear in terms of signage, in terms of entrance ways, in terms of the pathways to get to somewhere, and how that then might be affecting your use or your interaction with those spaces. So something like Belfast, again, is a good example. And this is hot off the press this afternoon from the conversation. And it was about the ways in which the physical context of the city, when aligned with the socio-cultural issue of the Troubles and ongoing segregation, has potentially been amplified by COVID because people have been able to return to their home areas, that use those places that they know more intimately rather than venturing further afield. And something like Parkrun is a classic example here, where people would go to Parkrun somewhere across the city because it's only in 2 or 3 places. Since it's been cancelled, they haven't been going across those lines, across those boundaries. So COVID might in one way have actually diminished their access to the wider city. And that then opens up questions about, is it the function or the amenity of that park, or is it the site itself? And I think in many places it's a combination of both. And this image here on the right sort of tries to talk through that about size versus value. And this notion of value is something that both the previous speakers sort of touched on. And I think it's really, really important in terms of how we understand the physical environment, in the fact that, is the big national park what you want to go to every week? Or is it the local park that's right around the corner, the quotidian place that you might use every day, the place that you place most value on? Do you want to get into the car and drive across town to walk the dog in a woodland, or do you just want to take it round the corner? And I think a lot of particularly planners always look at the big, the strategic, and forget the local and the personalized. And this is where the sort of the personal experience of our family in COVID has been quite strange, because Heaton Park, the biggest park in Manchester, is 2 minutes from our house. And I refused to go. My wife and the kids went every day. And so even though I know it's valuable, and even though it's quite big and do lots of different things there, I excluded myself. And I think there's an ongoing conversation to be had about whether people actually were using that space because they could, and it was the only place they could, and whether they then recognize the different values that they might get from it. And I think this raises the issue of equity really, really clearly. So over the last 6 months, there's been extensive reporting from across the environment sector about the value and the need for parks and green space, and that there's been a potential systematic inequality in funding and in development of parks, but in particular across parts of the UK, and London always pops up here. So there's been discussions from the Ramblers, from Fields in Trust, discussions in the New York Times about urban forestry, Public Health England, and they're looking at how green spaces are being promoted for certain communities and not others. And interestingly, Natural England have released a report in the last few days saying that whilst use of parks actually went up during the lockdown, it went down in teenagers and children. And what they're suggesting is that because parents were quite worried about their kids going out and playing, they actually stopped them going out as much. So the people who might use parks most frequently, so kids to play football or to go and play in the woods, actually their use went down. And so we have to question what the long-term implications of that are. And if you think about someone like Richard Love and his book, Last Child in the Woods, when he talks about nature deficit disorder, if we've started to split that understanding of outside and fun and the environment and playing in parks from children, is that going to have a long-term impact on their understanding and their use of it? And one thing that also comes out of all these different reports here is the role of metrics, and it's something that I'm very skeptical of. And metrics are the way in which we quantify things like distance or time or size to make them useful. So it's only 5 minutes from our house, therefore it's really good. It's 20 hectares, therefore it's a really good site. It's only 100 meters to walk, therefore it's good. And the most primary metric that we have in the UK is the Accessible Natural Green Space Standard. It's been around since 1995, give or take. So that's called ANGST. And over the last few years, the Natural England and the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, so DEFRA, have been doing work to try and understand the ways in which what they call green infrastructure, which includes parks, can be quantified to try and make it easier to put into policy. And part of that is to try and say, how far does something need to be from your house for you to use it? How long does it have to take for you to walk there before you stop using it? And what size does it have to be to make you want to go there? So again, issues around functionality come in here. And what I would question here is about the utility of these metrics, is that they remove the notion of context and they remove the notions of human behavior to give you a number and say, you are compliant with this policy, therefore you've got a good green space strategy. Whereas it doesn't necessarily tell you whether there's a main road to cross, whether you have to go across up a hill or down a hill to get to this park, whether the play area in that park is so out of date that kids can't play it because it's dangerous. So I think what's been brought forward in a lot of the discussions about green space and parks and COVID is that whilst it's interesting to use some of these metrics, it's not actually a foolproof way of understanding why people do or don't use these spaces. Because we have to look about the personal motivations. We have to think about the way in which some spaces are more enticing, and it might be because they have a toilet. And in a lot of these metrics, those kind of things have been pushed to one side. But where we come to with this is if we get something like the Accessible Natural Green Space Standards revisited, and this slide has changed in the last hour and a half, where the bit where it says definitely not for publication is still under embargo, so I can't actually talk about it. But what DEFRA and Natural England are doing, they actually are considering whether these 25-year-old metrics are still valid. And what's being found with this work is that they're still valid, but they lack a bit of nuance. They lack an understanding of how cities and urban areas have changed through expansion and then contraction, so issues of suburbanization and then moving back into city centres. They miss the understanding of how far people will walk if you have to cross a motorway. And an example would be Musgrave Park in Belfast. On one side is West Belfast, 4-lane motorway, the park's on the other side of the bridge. It takes a long time to cross because there's a main road there. So a lot of these things have to be built into this. But what is still valid about some of these ideas is that we need to have a hierarchy of spaces that we can engage with. We need to have a hierarchy of spaces that offer different solutions to different needs or different problems. And that might be having somewhere to walk the dog Monday to Friday, and a park to take the kids on a Saturday, and a woodland to go for a longer walk on a Sunday. And what ANGST does, it still says that we can have those things, and we should try and build that into all our forms of planning. And so on this very rambling personal journey that I've gone on in the last few weeks, that there are some key themes which have come out of this, which are both very interesting, very enlightening, but also very disturbing. We can say that the use of parks and green spaces throughout COVID has not just been about the size or the distance or the facilities, but a combination of all these things, that people will go to their local park because it's local, but they'll go somewhere else for a difference, for a change, to do something else. And I think that's really important for landscape planners, for politicians, for local government to understand. there's no point just having one big landmark park if it's not suitable for everybody. And trying to install that understanding of variation and this hierarchy of big, middle-sized and small, I think is really important. What has also come out of this is that the use of parks and green space is a very personal relationship. And it's a very personal set of understandings that motivate you to go to some places and not others. And that might be getting on your bicycle. It might be getting in your car. It might be walking. But the way in which we understand those places is going to change depending on who you are, where you're from, what your community is, and what your local context is. And here we've got pre, during, and post-COVID, and the sick is because we're not post yet. But I think these understanding of these relationships will be very prominent going forward, and particularly in the next couple of years when we still wrestle with austerity and the borrowing, the debt that the government's getting to pay for things like furlough. We're going to have to be quite clear about the value of parks. And there's also been, this use is partly a reaction to restrictions. What we noticed here in our park is that it was the only place people could go. So those midweek periods where you would normally get dog walkers or retired people in the park was full of people. And so there was a much greater swell of use during the week. Same use at the weekends, but since we've come out of lockdown, it's gone back to a normal early in the morning dog walkers, early evening dog walkers, middle of the day, people going for a stroll, not many other people. So we have to look quite carefully at what all this evidence is suggesting about in terms of long-term use or the value to different people. And what I would argue is that whilst there has been a massive increase in the use and the function and the value of parks over the last 6 months, I can't hand on heart say that will continue into next year or the year after, because I see the variation around us in Manchester, and I don't think it's got a long-term continuity. I think it's going to drop back to where we were before. But one other part of this is that we have to be very careful of is the way in which demographics and age groups are factored into these conversations. Manchester is a historic city, has Victorian parks, but they do vary in size, in composition and value depending on where we are. And that can hit some of the most unsustainable communities in terms of their employment, their tenure in housing hardest. So again, we have to think carefully about how those parks or those green spaces in communities which might be more low income, whether they're going to be maintained, how they're going to be improved, how they're going to meet the needs that people don't get from having a back garden in many cases. And how do you try and facilitate the use for small children, teenagers, middle-aged people like me, and older people in the same place? And there's been a lot of work about this interaction of different age groups, and they've never really found a solution. But people like Claire Risbeth at the University of Sheffield and Nick Dempsey there as well are trying to find some interesting patterns about co-uses and co-design using younger people and older people. But what's been really prominent about, particularly the reporting of the use of parks in COVID, is the haves and the have-nots. And it's language that I was teaching yesterday about the ladder of participation in Sherry Arnstein. And it's from the 1960s. And it talks about those people who have been purposefully excluded from the conversation. And I think what's happened with parks historically is that most people have been excluded from the conversation because they're either not planners, or they're not local authorities, or they're not developers. What COVID has done is potentially recast the balance here to actually allow people to have a greater say in terms of what they value and what should happen in their locations. So although their use might not go on continually over the next couple of years, I think there is going to be a permanence in terms of understanding the value of being outside and being in a different place and not staring at the same wall every day that might not have been there 6 months ago. So in many ways, I'm quite optimistic about where we go with parks and their value going forward. And in another way, I'm still very pessimistic about the ways in which government and the ways in which central government in particular have started to move away already from the value of public space and parks to back to the economy first rhetoric. And I think if that continues, then we might see another sort of fall off of use because the funding simply isn't there to manage these spaces. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'm sure we're all happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ian. That's great. Now I discovered the spotlight feature during this, so I now need to figure out how to unspotlight you so that everybody can appear. Okay, brilliant. So yeah, we can open up to questions. We've had a few come through during the presentation, so I'll just start working through those, and feel free to chip in with more questions in the comment box. And yeah, so the first one came during Colin's talk, but I think if anyone else on the panel has something to chime in with, go for it. So thank you for this great sharing of information. My question, until COVID, there has been a push for urban density, the social benefits, efficiency, and sustainability of this lifestyle. Now there is a knee-jerk reaction to move to the suburbs, where in the long term, we know this is not sustainable. How do we tame this? How do we continue to message to non-experts the benefit of healthy urban living? P.S. Great presentation so far, thank you again. So something to get started on, thinking about how we kind of, I suppose, promote healthy urban living and put that message forward.
Should I start, Alice, or?
Yeah, go for it.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the question. I mean, I think there's two things. I mean, I think one is that, and I probably should have made this clearer in my own talk, is that I think there's a lot of uncertainty around where all of this is going. I mean, we know certain things for sure. We know that the economic outlook is very bleak. We know there's been some kind of shuffling of people's attitudes and values, but we don't know to what extent those values and attitudes have permanently changed. And there isn't really a lot of evidence that I've seen that suggests there has been some significant shifts in people's attitudes. But there is a kind of a sense of it having happened. So that's the first thing. I think that's quite important. You know, if you look at previous crises, I saw a presentation by Ben Page of Ipsos Mori, the polling organisation in the UK, where he was saying if you look at previous crises, it's actually taking usually 5 or 6 years for real changes to really filter through and be felt. And you know, no real reason to assume that things will be different this time. On the other hand, I mean, if there is ever an opportunity to radically rethink the city and patterns of urbanisation, it's now. And there's a kind of need for some kind of, you know, population of that space. And I think a lot of urban planners and policymakers are actively asking themselves quite fundamental questions about how the urban environment's going to look. So we might see some shift, for example, towards suburbs or lower density or rural sites. And certainly if you look at places like Zoopla, the kind of UK real estate group, you start to see evidence of that, at least in the short term. And that may mean, for example, more a space freed up in city centres, which, as I was saying in my talk, have been very overheated. It might mean those spaces become more affordable. It might give local governments the opportunity to reinvent those spaces. We know from the past, for example, that sometimes when you have space freed up in parts of the city, it can become an incubator for different kinds of arts or cultural activity. So we may start to see positives in the sense of spaces that are kind of de-densifying in central areas being kind of hijacked for more socially oriented purposes. I saw a presentation recently about using shopping malls and offices for urban agriculture and for mixed housing. You know, so there are possibilities there. But as to whether, you know, as I was saying in my presentation, I think there's a longer term shift going on out of, you know, in terms of urbanization and peripheral expansion in many cities, not all cities, of course, across the globe, but that's a general trend, it seems. And so I would expect anyway, without the crisis, for suburbanization of different kinds to continue and COVID to kind of increase that. Whether that means a really radical shift, I have my doubts, but I mean, it's possible. I think that we're going to see more likely to see some smaller, more texture changes to the relationship between suburbs and city centres.
Thank you. I think we've got a few coming through actually, so I might just nip on to the next question. Obviously, if panelists want to jump in on other stuff and make a comment on that too, that's great. So question for Caroline, have we missed the cycling moment? As a cyclist, I noticed a decided uptake of cycling earlier in the pandemic, lots of new cyclists on the streets, but of late it feels that we've drifted back to normal patterns of road use.
I think you're right. I think we have drifted back to normal patterns of road use. And certainly, if we're thinking about the context around Aberdeen, I'm aware that traffic count sensors have put traffic levels at certain routes approaching Aberdeen to be over 100% of pre-COVID levels. And the other interesting thing that we're seeing is that people who were traditionally traveling to their place of employment by public transport are now traveling by car, which there's a suspicion this is accounting for this uptick in car usage. And they're parking their cars in the abandoned office car parks, where, if you like, white collar office workers used to traditionally park their cars. I can't say if that's nationwide, but I know that's a situation in Aberdeen. And I think what will be instrumental is how we encourage people out of their cars and back onto public transport. And I think part of it might be facilitating bimodal, multimodal trips by creating transport interchanges. But I am afraid that perhaps we have missed that moment because there was this great increase in cycling. And I think it's a cultural thing as well. Scottish people, UK people, not big fan of cycling in the rain and the wind. And I think we need to do more to make it easy for people to cycle to work. And there's a lot of work goes on in terms of providing workplace showers and things like that. But there's a lot of work we need to do to encourage people who want to be able to cycle to work.
Thank you. We have a question. I think all three of you are welcome to chime into this. Maybe we could start with Ian if you'd be up for it. How does climate change play into all of this?
I think climate change is one of it's almost along with health, maybe a get out of jail free card for some of the things we're talking about. It might be the thing that politicians in Westminster particularly actually consider to be valuable, because they seem to think other things are less so. So looking at the moderation of air pollution in London, for example, has led to quite significant changes in the physical composition of the city through investment in street trees, through new parklets, new park developments, looking at redoing river corridors to make them more ecological. And that's partly based on understanding the ecological needs, but also the impacts of pollution amelioration and lowering urban heat island effect, for example. Joined to that is now a public health benefit of people can go outside and use these spaces. So it's maybe part of a double-pronged approach that could be taken by, and it's not necessarily the environment sector. I think the environment sector has done this for so many years. It's just been banging its head against that wall for a long time. But if the professional bodies in the UK, so from my perspective, the Royal Town Planning Institute, Chartered Surveyors, the Landscape Institute, Town Planning Association, they have a lobbying position, they have a level of authority. And if they can make the current government listen, then maybe we'll do something different. The environment 25-year environment paper was actually quite supportive of some of these ideas. How that is then delivered, given where we are, I'm not quite sure. But I think climate change is something that politicians are starting to listen to, particularly at the local level, because they're starting to see people get annoyed about it in wards and in particular parts of the city. And if they start feeding that up through ward councillors to city government, then it starts to have a bigger impact. And we see that in Manchester and in Liverpool as well.
Thank you. And while you have your microphone potentially on, Ian, another question just coming through for you. How do you think fear or anxieties over COVID have influenced use of green space, particularly in deprived areas that lack equal access to green space?
I think it's become increasingly relevant. Just from my own experience, I know that has happened to me, but I think there are problems with people understanding that they're allowed to use parks, which are historical and are exacerbated in Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, because there seems to be a stigma about safety or use, or who's actually going to be there to watch you in some senses. And I think that the part of Manchester that we live, it's a very mixed white British, white Irish, British Muslim community. So actually the park is full of quite a range of people, but they're all quite local. So that locality issue is being quite prominent. So people are using it because they know the area. But if you were from a different part of the EU, for instance, or if you were from a different part of the world, that might not be the same. So I think there are a lot of places, particularly areas where the community isn't necessarily permanent, so there's a transience there, so that the people who are there all the time is going to change, and therefore there's a lack of familiarity between some people. I think that's problematic. And again, someone like Claire Risbeth at Sheffield is doing work with refugees and their use of park, and what she's found is that there's quite a long incubation period for them to transition to feel comfortable in that space and be accepted in that space. So I would expect that over the course of the last 6 months, a lot of people have maybe tried to go to the park, but actually then still felt it maybe wasn't for them because the same communities of people might not have been there, or they might have felt that they're still a little bit like a bit of the outsider and the other. But hopefully, I'm hopeful that it's been a bit of an easier transition. But from our experience, it seems fine. But I don't know about other parts of the UK.
Thanks, Ian. I think we've got one here that would work well for Colin. Thank you for the inspiring inputs. You've highlighted a lot. You've highlighted that there is scope and momentum for progressive change in this pandemic. However, there's also a lot of regressive answers, authoritarian backlashes. For example, dense suburbs, at least here in Germany, have been referred to as, quote, COVID-19 hotspots at the margins of society, recalling conservative underclass notions. How can we use urban research and radical scholarship to politicize, again in quotes, from below, and activate progressive answers and solidarity networks?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's really, really important. There was, because when I talk about density kind of being in flux, that's not necessarily just bubbling away with progressive ideas. There's all kinds of regressive and sometimes very troubling notions between density and the notion of contamination that we've seen over the last few months. And certainly this is a long history, this kind of idea of density as a kind of pathology, you know, something in the city that is a threat, and quite often class and race-based, that history. So we're seeing that play out for sure over the last year or so. So for example, right-wing commentators and institutes have sought to blame, for example, decisions to increase immigration in places like Britain during the 1990s, arguing that, you know, the Blair-Brown governments effectively created sort of multicultural dense neighbourhoods which became incubators of infection. And so we've seen those kind of claims being made here. In the US, groups like the Cato Institute have argued, well, they've always been arguing against density since September 11th and before. But they've been arguing now that this is yet another illustration of how the liberal kind of sort of liberal elites are enforcing their kind of fantasies of densification onto cities. You know, and it came up in the question earlier, you know, this kind of notion that density is a solution to all evils, you know, that it's good for the environment, it's good for social life, it's good for the economy. And parts of the right, parts of the political right in the US in particular, have always seen this as kind of anti-individualistic, as a kind of top-down, state-imposed ideological agenda to force people to live in certain kinds of ways, as opposed to the kind of frontierism of the kind of US imaginary, you know, that you kind of march out into your kind of acre of land and put your US flag down, or whatever it might be, British flag or whatever else it might be. So that's there. And there's also been, I mean, in places like South Africa, which I know a little bit, kind of the idea of de-densification during the early months of the pandemic was rolled into just old, typical anti-slum kind of rhetoric. You know, let's demolish the informal settlement, let's rehouse these people. It's good for them, actually. You know, we'll just shift them to some other part of the city. And that kind of rhetoric has come out and has been used as an excuse. I think I would take heart from the fact that there has been an emerging critique over the last couple of decades countering the notion that density is not so much that the notion that density is good for you, but the way in which density projects tend to work out in the city is to inadvertently sometimes benefit white middle class groups. And so we've seen a kind of confluence of groups across the urban worlds, grassroots groups often, coming together and sort of resisting this process, but also trying to say, look, there are other ways to build a dense city. And this is what I was saying about the notion of sort of knowledge and density, kind of using other ideas and imaginaries about what dense neighborhoods might look like. And there's a lot of people writing about this in fantastic ways. I mentioned Jay Pitter in Toronto during my talk, but also groups like Slum Dwellers International and the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, who have always begun with the idea of organizing dense communities to tell stories about their community, to produce data about their community, and to use that as an active politics to lobby the state and to demand recognition and change. And this is why I use the term value, because I think it is about recognition, it's about redistribution, it's about participation in the urban process. And so as open and as in flux as all this is, and as open therefore as it is to conservative agendas, there is also this opportunity to kind of come together amongst critically minded academics and activists to try to force through a different kind of agenda. I'll stop talking, sorry, Ian.
No, that's great, and definitely kind of picking up on some of the key questions about discourse and where this narrative is coming from, which ties into another question that I think would work well for you, Colin. Is the phenomenon of high density levels being less desirable very much an elite preoccupation where people who struggle with survival issues have to position space and safe distances way down on the list of concerns, where overcrowding and material struggle is far greater than concerns about COVID-19 safe space and green spaces?
That's a really good question, but I saw Ian with his hand up, so I'm going to take,
Sorry about that. Okay.
I don't want to hog the kind of virtual floor here. So I was like, Ian, I tend to blather and blather and blather, so I'm going to let Ian and Caroline come in, and then maybe I'll come in if there's time. But I might.
Apologies, didn't see your hand, Ian.
Can I just add one thing to Colin's last thing, actually, rather than this one? I think it's sort of, from a very technical, pragmatic perspective, I think the way in which density is looked at within planning is it's always going to be good because you get all the services in one place, but it doesn't necessarily think about the livability or the usability or the functionality of those places. So Manchester City Centre is a prime example. Really, really expensive real estate, lots of shiny buildings, lots of retrofitted warehouses, very desirable residents. If you're 26, if you're 35 or 45 or 55, nightclubs maybe not your thing. The bus stops aren't necessarily there. You're going to have to walk in the rain, so the pavements are very narrow, there's no green space. All the things that you might want to make a place livable aren't necessarily there. So whilst density is often promoted as being the way of addressing climate change or suburbanization, if people don't want to be there, then it fails instantly because people are going to move elsewhere. And the notion of the 15-minute city comes up here is like, that will work in some places where you have these pockets or urban villages, and London being the prime example of it. Used to be like that, it's now gone the other way, go back again. But somewhere like Manchester, you aren't going to get people relocating to Bury simply because it's not as desirable. So I think there's issues around what planners, what urban designers, what green space managers, what engineers, what developers are willing to give in terms of the repositioning of urban areas as a place that people want to be versus what will sell. And what will sell and the money you make on the returns is often outweighs all those other considerations.
Thank you, that's great. I don't know if Caroline or Colin want to jump back in on anything there.
I suppose it also relates to issues around gentrification, doesn't it? And then we can create environmental injustices in the sense that areas can be developed that are less desirable for your white collar middle classes, but I suppose other communities end up filling that void, and they can be in areas in our towns and cities that you run into environmental justice issues as well, which are becoming increasingly common. And I think that's the danger of any sort of forced densification that kind of Colin was speaking about, that you have to be careful how you engineer it, or it can be a social engineering project with some fairly significant consequences.
And I think there are examples of that, somewhere like Atlanta, where the Atlanta Beltline has been perceived as being a really, really transformative project for the city because it provides car owners with a way of getting around the city on foot, and links into transport-oriented design with the light railway and the bus hubs. But it's also seen as a gentrification tool for neighbourhoods where there's a lot of repossessions after 2008. So the white middle classes have moved in, pushed the prices up, forced out existing populations. So although it wasn't necessarily the plan to make areas more profitable, it's happened just by osmosis, because people who were in their early 30s want to buy a home. Where'd you go? You go to the place that's cheap, but that might be up and coming because they've got this new cool project next to it. And it's kind of, do you not do it to avoid that, or do you just do just enough stuff? So there's a lot of work now about just green enough or just good enough to sort of not tip the balance. And I think we need to be quite careful about not going too far one way or the other, because it kind of means that things could be left to stagnate, or we just start again. I don't think either are really good options.
Thanks, Ian. And that actually ties into a question that was written down for Caroline, but I think, again, if everyone wants to chime in or has 2 cents on this. So we have a participant who's explained that she's just completed a master's degree in city planning with a thesis topic, converting abandoned railways to active transportation routes. Question, how do we take this concept using baby steps in our urban settings and promote the conversion of unused city arteries? Are there any good examples? Things like Midtown Greenway in Minneapolis are often too overwhelming. So is there anything that you can think of that kind of get us there? Little baby steps, or a chunked down process, I suppose.
I can give you a local one that's part of the National Cycle Network in Aberdeen. It's the Deeside Way. It's a hugely popular commuter area that runs in from sort of the west of Aberdeen. It takes in some quite affluent suburban areas, but it's hugely popular, and it drops you straight down into a park, the Duthie Park in the middle of Aberdeen. And it's really good, high quality tarmac, but it is all within urban residential areas. And when you contrast that with sort of the other sort of railway, former railway outside of Aberdeen, which is the Far Martin and Buchan Way, it's kind of hardcore, sort of a lot of it, in the sense that it's closely packed aggregate. It's not so good. So I think the baby steps ultimately have to involve investment, and it has to be tarmac. And that's expensive and it's difficult. And there needs to be political will, but at least, you know, Sustrans and other organizations obviously offer funding to support those conversions. And I think it requires multi-party working, and it requires political will is what it requires as well. You need some really brave politicians to stand up and say, I want this and I want to see the project through.
And I think in addition, there's again, that political will and that political almost branding that you get with it. So the High Line has been the poster child of this, and it's really good, but not necessarily the best for that part of New York. The Camden High Line, which is badged on the High Line in New York, has gone down the same way, and it's reusing sort of semi-derelict network rail stuff to try and do the same thing and promote sustainable transport. There's the Underline in Miami, which goes underneath a freeway, which is, I think, far more in tune with actually allowing different communities to use that area. So, and there's quite a few examples in China, say in Shanghai or in Beijing, of using underneath freeways to make new parks and new linear routes, because they don't really do much else. So I think in a lot of places, I mean, Seoul and the changing of the expressway to make the new stream riparian corridor and to make a urban parks at the first floor level have been doing this, but it does take a very brave and strong and financially supported mayor to do it, and that's not necessarily the case everywhere, I don't think.
Yeah, I was just going to briefly add to that, I think kind of the relationship between these different processes we've been describing here and the kind of economic and political realms is just really, really important. And perhaps, you know, that's something that certainly I've spoken enough about here this evening, because I think that we're now at a point in the UK, at least, where the debate has kind of shifted to kind of one around sort of the extent to which the state is willing to borrow and invest. And we're in a very kind of deeply kind of ideological territory now in the UK context, where a government sort of committed to levelling up, as Boris Johnson continually called it, is now kind of like reached a kind of point where they're claiming, you know, enough is enough. Effectively, it's time to start rolling back on spend. So a lot of what we're saying, there are deep inequalities around it in terms of cycle lanes, in terms of public parks, in terms of densification. I think we've all said there are these deep inequalities, and where I live, you see it. You know, some of the towns that are really struggling post March compared to those that are thriving. We're already, you know, it reflects who was doing well before and who was doing badly before. You know, it's intensifying those inequalities. And to what extent the state is willing to kind of pony up with the necessary capital to invest in infrastructure, housing and training in areas which are about to be hit with massive unemployment. You know, I mean, London is going to be probably all right because London is London, although there'll be huge inequalities. But places like Newcastle in the northeast of England are going to need significant state investment for a number of years. And we're already seeing a real kind of retrenchment of the Conservative government, which is akin to a kind of Thatcherite sort of politics. And that, I think, is we need to really factor that in to the kind of political struggle for cities post-COVID, that kind of question of economic policy, the political economy of these decisions, the sort of left behind places is going to be so central, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's really important and feeds into this much bigger discussion that we've got. So just a last couple of questions, I think. We've got a couple for Ian, one for everyone, and then maybe we can kind of finish up with just a take home that you'd kind of like to express about how we can think forward and what the next steps are, essentially. But okay, so for Ian, we have a question about lockdown in the UK and use of parks and green spaces and whether restrictions were in place to affect different groups using different green spaces. And relatedly, parks and public spaces are frequented by different social groups, as you've mentioned, and therefore make great places to analyse how people are managing this new normal in terms of social distancing and masks, and how this affects sociability in these places, particularly regarding children. And do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the issue of different user groups using these places differently is really important, because I think it relates to the location and the size and the quality of those places. So if you've got a really nice new park, and somewhere like Burgess Park in Peckham has just been renovated, and it was a very strong community hub anyway, but actually made it even more popular because people could do lots of different things there. So you've got a set of diverse communities who might use that site anyway, and that across age ranges and across different ethnicities, which was sort of promoted by actually having a nicer place to go. I think in other places where there are different ways in which communities from South Asia, for example, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, use parks as groups. And I think that has been hit a little bit by the now the rule of 6 and the 2 meter distancing. I think we see a lot of communities who normally go to parks as a collective, and it might be in Manchester, in Lower Broughton, the Orthodox Jewish community, the young mothers taking the kids to the playgrounds where the men are stood half a mile away having a gossip. That went down a little bit as well, but that's sort of started to come back. And so I think you see social bonds being strengthened because it might be the only place people can go out and see their friends, or it might be weakened if you're, and this might be more about being white and British rather than being British and or something else, because parks in the UK for white British people, it tends to be single people on a bicycle or walking or running or running or walking their dog. So that becomes more of an issue because you don't necessarily have that community. Whereas if you are from a Polish community, as there is in Cheetham Hill in Manchester, or a South Asian from a certain part of Pakistan, which is down the road, they actually come together anyway. Siblings and children, I think, has been quite an interesting one. I think it reflects, again, the parents' mentality. So our children have not really played with other children in the park, even though they normally would. They have in the play area in the last like 6 weeks, but because they'd be running everywhere, then it's kind of, well, we need to keep a social distance, so we kind of have to keep them away from people as well. And that was really difficult. And I think, again, for people with large families or large social groups, that was really hard, because they have to try and maintain a level of conforming to the rules whilst fundamentally going against their nature of their community. And I think those things are going to be felt for quite a long time, where people have to start to rebuild their relationship with those sites, but also with their community. Because if you've not seen your best friends for 6 months, they've not been able to talk to them within sort of face to face. I think that's quite difficult. The kids, I think, are fine. They just go and run around and do what they want. They seem to be immune to what's going on. I think it's adults and their uncertainty about the problems and the severity of it, which has been more of an issue. But yeah, it's interesting to try and understand how different communities have reacted to this. And I think those with quite strong bonds have done really well to keep those bonds. I think people who maybe live on their own have found it a lot more difficult.
Thank you. Okay, so we have one last question then for everyone, and I apologise for the questions that we haven't been able to cover, but I realise people have dinner to eat and things to do and all that kind of thing, unfortunately. But it's great to see that this is a topic that everyone is so keen to explore more. I think that's really encouraging. So quick one for everyone really is that density and provision of outdoor space and transport all have a role to play in the notion of livable streets, in quotes. We've seen many roads becoming pedestrianised and restaurants making use of the immediate road space. Do you think this is something that will remain after COVID?
I think a lot of it comes down to political will again. There's been quite a lot of acrimonious dispute around some of the low traffic neighbourhoods, and you see it a lot in social media that there's been efforts made to try and sabotage the spaces that have been set aside for walking and cycling. But ultimately, when you see the photographs of people out enjoying themselves in these spaces, it's hard not to buy into that ideal. But I think, and I know this from speaking with officers and local authorities here, that they're keen to pursue some of this on a long-term basis, but it all relies on the elected members, so the politicians actually buying into the idea too. I can't comment on the situation in England. I'm not familiar enough with the political structures for a lot of local authorities down there, but from my perspective, I think people do want to see it, but it's whether the vocal minority drown out what just your average person on the street wants to see.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think there's kind of two things I guess I'd say. One is there's kind of an inherited network now, isn't there, of kind of cycleways. Some of them are temporary, and some of them are more sort of permanent, that have resulted from COVID. And you hear these kind of statistics from some cities, sort of Barcelona, Berlin, London, Paris, of the just sheer quantity of cycle lanes they've put in over the last 6 months. And to some extent, that's kind of sort of activist-minded kind of officials of any municipal structure seizing an opportunity. And then you kind of get this embeddedness, I suppose, of an infrastructure. Once it's there, it's harder to shift. Just the kind of embeddedness of sort of cities. And there might be an element of, a lot of them just hang around. But then there's also this kind of as you say, Caroline, this kind of deep kind of like politics, isn't there, around these kind of cycleway. We've seen it here. We've got this kind of coastal cycleway now, which is fantastic. But a lot of people who I would have anticipated would have been in favour were incredibly critical of this. It was very much like, it's really important we get into cycling. It's really important we get people moving. It's good for the climate. It's good for people's health. But, not where I live. I mean, I've got to then drive around the block to get to where I want to go, and literally, this is not an exaggeration. The guy in the local cycle shop was complaining about it because he had to park his car in a different place. And I thought, right, but there's a serious point behind it, which gets back to kind of what I was saying earlier, which is that we just don't know to what extent sort of larger social attitudes have really shifted you know, if a pandemic can't shift the dial on certain kind of attitudes, then you do wonder sort of what it would take to do that. But maybe we'll start to see, you know, a kind of percolation and a kind of sedimentation of habits. You know, just the sheer fact that people have been doing these things now for so long. We're talking about going back into lockdowns in lots of parts of Europe and beyond. Perhaps we'll start to see a sedimentation of habit, and it's that in the end, the embedded infrastructure, the ingrained habits, which kind of shift the dial over time rather than the politics and the struggles around the politics. I don't know.
I'd like to add one final characteristic to this, and that's for those people in the UK, they understand this, and that's the weather. That this transformation of city centre roads is amazing, but do you want to have your dinner in the rain and the snow in Aberdeen or in Durham or in Manchester in December? I don't, and I think that's going to be a big issue with this, with the ongoing engagement with it. That if we can find a way to make outside warm and dry, then I think it could work magnificently. But they do it in different countries, and where you have hot weather, it's great. Where you have really cold weather, they have mechanisms. So in Canada, but I think the rain in Manchester might put quite a few people off the notion of these more livable and functional streets that aren't for cars.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, so I guess final thoughts really. If we want to start with you, Ian, because I think the Zoom spotlight is still on you. So if you have any final thoughts, any takeaways of kind of what you think we need to be thinking about in terms of green space inequality going forward, and whether this pandemic has changed, as Colin was kind of alluding to, has that been able to change our narrative as we think about green space inequality?
I think it's helped to change the narrative by making it front and centre in political debates. I think it was always front and centre in local politics because people get very wound up about their park and it's very personal. But to have the Minister for Housing, Culture and Local Government say parks are an essential infrastructure, that's the win we've all been asking for. If they continue with that, then we've gone some way to hopefully addressing some of these issues. In terms of sort of larger social attitudes and behaviours, I'm still uncertain about the longevity of this change. I think over the winter we'll really see whether or not that move to more cycling or more going to the park comes to fruition, because it's going to be dark and cold. And if we see people on a Wednesday afternoon in the park just going for a walk, then I think we have changed attitude in terms of how people are valuing and using those spaces. If it goes back to, say, normal lower level uses, I think then people have almost forgotten. So whilst it was really visible, it was a thing that they thought about, but actually when it comes back to being the new normal, then maybe not so. But so pessimistic and optimistic at the same time.
That sounds like a good balance that sort of sums up 2020 in general. Caroline, do you want to chime in with any final thoughts?
I think just to echo Ian's thoughts there, that there's pessimism and there's optimism. I think given the increasing traffic levels we're seeing, you can't help but feel that maybe that initial surge in cycling, we're probably going to settle back into the levels that we saw pre-COVID. But one of the things that comes up consistently in cycling research are the mental health benefits of getting out there and cycling. And so many people say that it helps them manage their mental health. And I'd like to think that for some people in the pandemic, that walking and cycling has been a way of supporting their own resilience and of clearing their head and of getting that headspace. And that's the bit that gives me optimism, because ultimately a lot of the choice that people make around cycling, it's not just that it's convenient, it's about how it makes them feel. And I think that's the positivity that I'd go forward with. But I think we need to do some work, because the reality is that climate change is happening and we might be forced into making some of these transportation choices sooner rather than later. And if we can encourage people to think about sustainable travel, it's going to make that transition a whole lot easier.
Thank you. And Colin, do you have any final thoughts that we can take away from today?
Well, I mean, firstly, thank you for the opportunity to be part of it. I've learned a lot from it, and the fellow speakers and the questions. And I would say that one of the things that really strikes me about this is that I think it is a genuinely open moment. I've seen, I think, because we spend so much of our time now going to these webinars and online and stuff, you know, like kind of fairly senior kind of urban people around different places giving talks and saying, you know, in terms of policymakers and so on, and saying that they're genuinely uncertain and genuinely open to kind of like, now whether or not you believe them is a separate issue, and of course politics has all kinds of ingrained histories, but I think there is a window of opportunity to kind of populate the conversation about the future of the city and how we want cities to structure, what they're for. It's simply because people just don't know where we're going with it. There's a kind of openness there, and in relation to density specifically, I think there is a greater questioning of density, why we want it, who it's for, and the kind of relationship between density and inequality, I think, is much more on the agenda. There's all sorts of great things about density, but there's all sorts of things about density which perhaps need to be, where there needs to be kind of more critical questioning, and we're seeing that happening across the world in different cities in different ways. So I feel, I guess, like my fellow speakers, I do feel sort of hopeful, but it's kind of, yeah, a real sense of radical uncertainty and opportunity within that, and we'll have to wait and see where we go from there. So I think there's a lot we can all do to help populate that agenda, though.
Thank you. That's been brilliant, and thank you. So thank you for everyone for coming along and for giving up your Tuesday evening if you're in the UK. Certainly you could have, if you're in Aberdeenshire, been sitting in the street enjoying a meal, as Ian was alluding to. It's perfect weather for it. And thank you to our speakers for a really, really engaging discussion. From the comments that are coming through, it looks like everyone's really enjoyed it. So thank you to everybody for coming out. And I think maybe the takeaway is that ultimately these are really uncertain times. And I think the discussion tonight has provided some clarity, but also, as all good webinars do, raise a lot more questions. So final things really is to say that the recording for this will be processed and hopefully go up on YouTube in the next few days, IT dependent. And also to make you aware that we do have 2 more incredibly different seminar series discussions coming up. So on the 3rd of November, we have a talk from Professor Sarah Pedersen about the politicization of Mumsnet, and it's already being discussed quite adamantly on Mumsnet, so it should be interesting. So if you feel like coming along for that, keep an eye out for it. And then later in November, we have a talk from Alice Wilson about the tiny house movement. So all very different, and hopefully a break from the realities of COVID and the implosion of 2020. So other than that, really just to say thanks again for everybody coming along. Thanks to our speakers, and stay safe to everybody.